swiftly approached the driver's seat and saw a woman in her early 50s lying there, motionless. Her chest rose and fell slightly, her pale skin appearing even paler from the rain, and she was breathing, albeit weakly. Raindrops struck the car's windows, scattering glass fragments everywhere from the driver's seat to the woman's leg. Without wasting time, David, to be severely confined with the smashed front section, attempted to open the door, but the force of the collision had caused it to fold inward, snagging on the edges. After multiple tries, he pulled as hard as he could with his moist hands. David leaned as the door cracked open and glass fragments dropped into the woman's lap. The woman's face had a slight trickle of blood over her anxiously, and her pulse was weak but steady. He gently caressed her face to see whether she was conscious. The woman's eyes twitched slightly, but did not open completely when he questioned, "You hear me?" David's main worry at the time was that if he wasn't careful enough, the large metal pieces may crush her leg. He took a moment to collect his breath before placing his hands on the margins of the wound to prevent further damage. With his muscles clenched, he attempted to lift the metal with all of his effort. He gritted his teeth because the metal's icy, rain-slick surface made things harder. He controlled his breathing and tried again, but the rain had increased to the point of flooding. The streets, the thunder overhead combined with the sound of the droplets striking the workshop's roof, creating a background noise that kept rumbling, and suddenly David saw movement. Blue lights were flickering at the top of the utility pole out of the corner of his eye, and a moment later there was a powerful spark explosion, after which the cables atop the pole stretched, and the electricity on the pole crackled loudly. Rain and wires were getting dangerous, and a terrible sensation of terror swept over me. At last, David used all of his might to raise the metal plate just a little bit inside. When the woman's leg was eventually released from its imprisoned position, she softly grumbled, but she wasn't quite conscious at the moment David was getting ready to. David's eyes widened as he lifted her, and one of the electric cables fell quickly. For a moment, the entire town was enveloped in darkness as all of the street lights went out. David took a deep breath after being startled by the unexpected darkness. The storm was now blowing even harder, and there seemed to be a deathly calm in the town. "This can't be," he whispered yet. The woman's consciousness might be waning, therefore there was little time to spare, and putting her outside in this cold was dangerous. He gently put his arms around her waist, holding her head and neck as her heavy body and damp garments made. Even though it was hard for David to carry her, he refused to give up when the rain came. As the storm grew more intense, David started to advance slowly but steadily toward the direction of the. Nevertheless, he didn't care that his muddy boots sank with each step. The warm lights of the workshop seemed like a beacon of hope amid the chaos, and all I could think about was getting this woman to safety. David clenched his teeth and carried the woman for the final few steps during the storm. David shut the door and inhaled deeply as the storm outside raged with all its power. He quickly started to examine the woman's injuries because time was running short. Little Lily was sleeping in the warm chamber behind the workshop when the woman was carefully taken there, lit by the room's corner fireplace's gentle flames. David laid the woman carefully beneath a blanket that was slightly curled from the warmth, and Lily's little breath could be heard. The young girl massaged her eyes as Lily opened her drowsy eyelids on the couch, looked at her father and said, "Daddy." David, in a drowsy voice, right away, replied, "Don't worry, honey. We need to treat this woman. Could you please bring me the phone?" Despite her continued drowsiness, Lily took a few tentative steps after sensing the gravity in her father's voice, snatched up the phone and passed it to David, who promptly contacted 911 and gave an explanation. The circumstance when providing the address, but the operator told him that because of the confusion brought on by the. David clenched his teeth, knowing that the ambulance would be delayed due to the storm in the town, required to assist the woman. So he set down the phone, picked up a towel, and started to pat her dry because she was sopping wet and her clothing were sticking to her. The warmth of the fireplace was warming the room a little because of the rain, but David knew he needed. A slight moan escaped the woman's lips as she hurried to keep herself from becoming cold. Her lashes quivered and her eyelids twitched before she opened her eyes as the woman's eyes opened, and her face wrinkled in agony. What's happening? And where am I? David leaned slightly over her and spoke in a soothing manner. Hey, you're safe. And you had an accident, but you'll be fine. An ambulance is on its way. The woman touched her leg abruptly while furrowing her brow in an attempt to feel her body. My leg, David, she moaned in agony. He sat next to her and quietly inquired, Can you sit? After noticing that she was riding slowly in agony. The woman gritted her teeth and sat up gradually. But even this action made her face hurt so much. It became even more obvious that her leg was broken when she looked at it. David's crooked posture, crushed tissue, and edema demonstrated the severity of his condition, necessitating an immediate choice. The ambulance would be delayed, and the woman would sustain worse injuries if she were moved without first stabilizing her leg. He got up, went inside, and retrieved some thick rope and 2 pieces of wood of equal size. At the same moment, he discovered to make his task simpler, he switched on a battery-operated light to better illuminate the area, but the woman was still. David tried to divert her attention with gentle words as she was moaning in agony, but he knew he had to assist her. What's your? When he questioned her name, the woman blinked, her face twisted in agony, and she said, Maria. David noticed her clenching her teeth as he started to support her leg. Maria let out a loud cry, but he had to continue despite his eyes welling up with tears. David tried to soothe her right away, but it's over. He did so cautiously, swiftly wrapped the strong rope, connecting the 2 pieces of wood on either side of her leg with beads of. Her damp hair was clinging to her face, and her perspiration was streaming down her forehead. But there, David gazed at her understandingly, and there was a glimmer of relief in her eyes. Although it hurts, Maria, this will prevent further harm to your leg. She nodded weakly as she tried to gather her breath and muttered, Thank you, in a horror voice. However, serious David looked closely at Maria, whose long, gray-tinged hair was in a gentle curls despite her advanced age. She appeared well-groomed and robust, and her clothing appeared too. She was likely a significant individual prior to the catastrophe, but she was lovely and meaty. Regardless of who she was or why she was in the town at the moment, she was only someone in need of assistance. David remarked with a gentle grin, I'm David, and I hope. It's nice to see you awake. Maria closed her eyes, and the ambulance will arrive shortly. David took the situation, opened them slightly, and then opened them again right away. Really, I told you not to go to sleep because you hurt your head and I don't want you to. David rapidly retrieved the first aid kit after losing consciousness and started washing Maria's injuries. Little Lily observed everything from the sidelines in silence. With her eyes wide awake and tiny fists gripping her blanket tightly, she watched intently as her father assisted As David treated her wound, Maria, a stranger, observed his tender care and took taking a deep breath and whispering, Thank you, David, over the cozy campfire flames, made the space feel safe and secure, in contrast to the storm outside, while the town outside was. Despite the cold and gloom, a new story was starting inside. David experienced a feeling of comfort as he heard the approaching sound of the howling storm outside. Shadows are created by sirens, the ambulance's blue and red lights, and the flickering light from the fireplace. Something moved over the workshop's walls when David was standing just in front of the door. He gave a sidelong glance and turned. Lily, his kid, had never left his side. Her tiny hands were. David said to Lily, Grab your coat, sweetheart, as she held her blanket securely, nodded rapidly, dropping her blanket and moving cautiously to the room's corner to retrieve her outerwear in the interim. Maria's face remained pale as she turned to face David, but the curiosity in her eyes were unmistakable, and she gulped softly and spoke weakly. Will you come to the hospital? David inquired, grinning subtly, understanding that Maria had had a rough night, and he could tell she didn't want to spend a short time at the hospital by herself. Maria's eyes sparkled with a mix of appreciation and apprehension, and David put aside. Without hesitation, he nodded his head slightly and replied, I don't want to leave you alone. Just before the ambulance arrived at the scene, Maria nodded slightly and appeared to be more relaxed. 2 paramedics hurried in, and David took a few steps back as they carried the stretcher into the room. David took a quick look at Maria's leg after the paramedics thoroughly checked it and noted how well it had been stabilized. One of them said, "You've stabilized her leg. That's really good," David said plainly. Not that he cared about Maria's safety, because the medical staff. Lily gently placed Maria on the stretcher and squeezed her father's hand while the young child stared in silence. As long as she was with her father, everything happened with her feeling safe. The ambulance's inside was bright and warm, and the sound of the motor muffled the storm sounds. When the car rocked, David grabbed Lily and wrapped her in his arms. Maria lay on the small girl's shoulder, her head snugly resting on his. She was exhausted but too scared to close her eyes. Stretcher with her eyes half closed, occasionally looking at David, who saw the contemplative look on her face, but didn't think about it because the night had already lasted long enough. As soon as they got at the hospital, the doors opened, and the staff hurried Maria into David held Lily's. David took a big breath, moved behind the ambulance, and sat down as they approached the waiting area. Lily cuddled up next to him, resting her head on his lap on one of the seats. Lily and Maria, David waited in silence while the physicians treated them. Even though the storm was still roaring outside, the night felt a little safer inside the hospital, and it seemed like time was passing. David sat motionless in the waiting area of the hospital corridor. Lily stood by her father in silence, sometimes closing her eyes to relieve the strain inside him. Her eyes and falling asleep, but she struggled to doze off during the hours after the storm outside had subsided and the rain's rhythm had finally diminished. When the intervention room opened, a white-coated doctor emerged. David. He got up right away and inquired, "How is she?" with impatience and worry in his eyes. The doctor nodded with a weary but comforting grin, his voice quivering a little. "She has a broken leg, but it's been healing nicely, so don't worry. Placed in a cast after she struck her skull, but we'll retain her because there isn't any significant damage. Monitored for a whole day to make sure she's beginning to improve. If you like, you can see her right now." David exhaled a sigh of relief and held. When they entered the room, Lily's hand trailed the doctor to the door. Observed Maria resting on the stretcher. Her face remained open despite her eyes being sleepy. Maria was pale but conscious, and she gave a small grin at seeing David and Lily. "David. Thank you so much, David." David grinned and shook his head, saying, "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there." Maria turned to Lily, "But it's nothing at all, and nobody else would have done the same." Observing her tiny yet powerful hands. "You seem like such a composed girl, don't you?" Lily stroked Maria's hand with a gentle smile, saying, "You'll get better, ma'am." The small girl's voice had an unusually assured tone, and Maria blinked, then nodded and grinned broadly, saying, "Yes, I'll get better." After quietly remaining at Maria's side for a little while longer, David and Lily told her to go to bed and left the hospital when the rain had all but stopped by the time they went outdoors. By the time they arrived at the town, the storm had subsided and the quiet had returned. They were so exhausted from the workshop that Lily curled up in a tiny bed. David got into the bed in her room, which was a tiny space with a fire for warmth. Before he closed his eyes, he reflected on everything that had occurred that evening, including the storm, the accident, and Maria. Occurred so abruptly, but at least everyone was safe now. Breathed deeply. He closed his eyes while listening to the fireplace's gentle crackle in the tiny space. As the father and daughter fell asleep peacefully, David put in endless hours to complete the order. His hands molded the wood, but his mind kept returning to what had happened that evening. Previously, though, he had to concentrate on his work because the client needed to be happy, because he needed a constant flow of work at the moment. After adding the finishing touches, David examined the table and sighed in satisfaction after delivering the order and observing on the customer's face. It somewhat relieved his weariness. The money he made would enable him to survive for a while, but how long could this continue? He inhaled deeply in the workshop. How long is this going to last? Finally, he told himself that he was working odd jobs to make ends meet, but at that time, Maria, there was no assurance of what the future might hold. David made the decision to abandon Lily after considering that she ought to remain in the hospital. He visited a flower shop en route to the hospital with the neighbors and selected a delicate. David visited Maria's room with a bouquet before making his way directly to the hospital. As soon as he went in, he saw that Maria looked better. She was exhausted but more recovered. Gazed at the flowers David had brought and smiled softly. Incredibly considerate of you. David put the flowers on the little table by the bed and murmured, "Thank you," and gave a small nod. "I wanted to see how you were feeling," Maria moaned. Gently, "I'm fine. At least," as the chat went on, "I felt better." After a minute, David posed a question after noticing that Maria was alone in the quiet room. He asked, "Is there anyone you'd like to call?" and held out his phone to her. Maria grinned. She smiled, but it was a little sad. "I don't have anyone to call, David." Her response pained me. "I'm sorry to hear that," he added candidly. And then Maria furrowed her brow. David assured her that Lily was secure when she raised her eyebrows and inquired about her whereabouts with the neighbors. But Maria's face stayed anxious, and when she asked her mother David, her throat became parched. He swallowed, looked away, and bowed his head a little before she departed. Maria's eyes widened a little as she inhaled deeply and looked at, softened the sadness of her muttering, and for a few period, silence fell between them. But the discussion then gradually went on. Maria started discussing her past, saying, "I'm the CEO of a big company," stated, "I've devoted my life to success, but I faced many challenges. David listened to me in order to succeed in the business world, even if there were moments when I forgot why I was working." Maria said intently, "I even had this accident while rushing to a meeting. Without giving it much thought, I simply hopped into my car when flights were canceled because of the storm." Inside, she shook her head. "But why was I in a hurry?" David saw the vulnerability in everyone's eyes while I worked so much, expecting her to be resilient and prosperous. But David, she was experiencing internal turmoil. He said with a gentle smile, "I know you probably don't want advice, but life. Maria, it shouldn't be this way. Sometimes you have to live to rest. If you simply go through everything quickly, Maria's eyes won't be left behind." She broke down in tears as she realized that no one had talked to her with such sincerity in a long time. Had instructed her to pause and take a deep breath. "Thank you, David," she muttered, and David nodded. Gently, it seemed like a turning point for them both at that precise moment. Reminder that life was more than work obligations, hardships, and perhaps Maria's life would change as a result of this event. It was time for her to be released from the hospital when her helper showed up to collect her. Maria spent some time gazing out the window of the hospital room, taking in the serene ambience of the town temporarily eased the turmoil within her. But now she had to return to the city to finish her recuperation. She would stop working until her leg was completely healed. Nevertheless, she couldn't stop thinking about David no matter how far she went. After a few days in the city, her leg healed and she was able to walk, comfortable once more. But she was still lacking something inside, which is why when she got back to town, her first thought was to see David. So she headed directly to the workshop. When little Lily entered, she saw her and rushed over the young girl with excitement. Gazed curiously at Maria's leg and inquired, "It looks new, Maria." Chuckled. "Yeah, Lily, almost like new," she said, then turned to look around. David walked into your dad's eyes as the tiny room's door opened. His eyes brightened upon seeing Maria. "Maria. How are you, Maria?" she said, smiling considerably more, and then stopped a little before adding, "I want to take you out. David, we need to discuss over dinner tonight." He stared at her in surprise. He hadn't anticipated that, but in some way, it made him smile a little. Naturally, he went to Lily and asked, "Sweetheart, would you like me to leave? You and your uncle tonight?" Lily exclaimed with delight. Yes, that night David and Maria had come before David and was seated at one of the best restaurants in town. David saw the resolve in her eyes as she waited for him at a table in the corner. Maria took a long breath and started talking. "I've given it a lot of thought, David." "You were?" "Yes. I'm merely chasing after stuff and constantly in a hurry. I'm not living this life. I just have my work and no one else." But David sadly shook his head. "So perhaps it's the cost of success." But Maria firmly shook her head, saying, "I don't want to live like." David looked at her firmly as she stated, "This anymore. I'm done with it." He was pulled to her as he cautiously attempted to comprehend her. Something had stirred within of him. But after talking, he withdrew while he considered whether these feelings were incorrect. As they ate dinner, they strolled beside the restaurant along the river, which glistened in the. After a while of walking in solitude under the moonlight, Maria abruptly stopped and turned to face David, whom she had grown to adore. "This town is a peaceful place," she murmured with a soft grin, and David agreed. Stated, but something was preventing him from losing himself in her silent gaze. David carefully leaned in near Maria as their gazes conveyed all. Maria softly lifted her hand to stop him as he was ready to kiss her, saying, "David, you're so young," she murmured. "I don't want to do this to you." But David firmly shook his head. I gave her a soft kiss without hearing what she had to say, saying, "I don't care, Maria." He added, "You've never left my mind," which startled Maria, but also made her feel somewhat relieved. Replied that evening, although their paths did not permanently divide. Maria began going to the town more often after their separation, and she was progressively leaving her. Realizing that her time in the town brought her tranquility, and that one day she spent time in the corporate world behind. Entered David's workshop, where she was carrying the house's deed. David gave her a startled look as she replied, "I've decided to move to this town," her eyes gleaming. Maria nodded in agreement, saying, "I want to live here and continue my life here if you." David grinned broadly as he said, "I would love to live with you." Truly enjoyed that Maria one evening as she was looking at the sculptures David had made in his workshop. She was once more amazed with his skill with the wooden. David's enthusiasm for his furniture was evident in the handcrafted details and the care that went into each item. Nevertheless, she gave him a gentle grin and paused to reflect before turning to face him. He gently asked David what his dream was, what he truly wanted to pursue. David hesitated for a second. Nobody had ever asked him that question before. So, when he heard Maria's, he lowered his eyes and let out a quiet sigh before raising his head and grinning slightly. He said, "You know, I've always wanted to open my own boutique hotel. Tiny, comfortable space where people may relax. I would like to make all the wooden. I would personalize the furnishings in every nook and cranny, creating a space where I could pour my heart out." As Maria saw she could feel the warmth in David's eyes and understood how much she grinned, but David didn't see that she deserved to fulfill his aspirations. Thinking behind that smile, Maria showed up a few days later with a large. To her astonishment, she discovered a sturdy, yet ancient building beside the river, which she purchased to help David fulfill his ambition that. When Maria approached David one day, while he was working in the workshop with a key, there was a lot of excitement, and, with delight in her eyes, she put the key in David's hand and muttered, "This will be your hotel, David." He gazed at the key he was holding. His heart began to race with surprise as he glanced at Maria and opened his mouth. He said, "Maria, this is too much." But his words became stuck in his throat. Shook her head softly, meeting David's eyes and whispering, "I want to live my life here. Lily with you, David, if you'd want." For a few more seconds, David observed her, taking in her sincere gaze. He smiled softly as he felt the warmth that dispelled all of his internal concerns. He said, "I accept it with joy," while holding the key in his hand and nodding. David was quite excited as he started his journey toward a new beginning. As he worked to create his own hotel, he constructed every detail by hand, created every piece of wooden furniture by pouring his heart and soul into each area, transforming it into a space where visitors could find solace and tranquility. Maria, David, and Lily started residing in a tiny but comfortable cabin next to the hotel, beside the river, in a serene, romantic setting. As Lily grew up and David and Maria repaired each other's wounds, life embraced them. Happily, they were no longer by themselves, clinging to the bond they had established. A lovely family, their existence was weaved with affection. Consequently, David, Maria, and Lily carried on with their new life in peace. In the center of the town, by the river, represented a family expanding with love. After achieving his dream, David created his own boutique hotel and put his all into every detail. Lily was growing up in a caring environment, and Maria at last felt like she was living. Environment. While some individuals strive for achievement, others learn that genuine pleasure can be found in love serenity, and if you like this story, please share that Maria and David had taken the second route. Remember to like and subscribe to my channel so that I may continue to write videos and share amazing stories with you every day. Support is really important to me. Thank you.